Good morning, everyone. Everyone, and I see.
Good morning.
Good morning, Vanessa.
Good morning. It's great to see everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And again, we are so glad to have Jim back at Virtual Macomb Solel Lakeside. He will be speaking for, let's say, an hour. There'll be time at the end. We may run over for questions. So you can put them in the chat, and we're going to take them at the end. Right, Jim?
Except for I'm speaking for an hour and 15, we said.
Hour and 15. All right. So you have to wait even a little bit, teeny tiny longer. So.
And then questions.
Then questions, right. Jim Kenney is recognized around the world as a pioneer and leader of the global interreligious and intercultural movement. He has lectured widely in the US and around the world on a variety of subjects relating to politics, religion, history, and culture. He was for 45 years the co-founder and executive director of Common Ground, a groundbreaking adult study center focusing on the world's great religious, philosophical, spiritual, and cultural traditions. And I'm sure it's just, you know, he didn't put in there that he is a frequent speaker at Macomb Solel Lakeside, and we are so happy to welcome you back on this Sunday morning. And with no further ado, I'm going to spotlight you, Jim, and we're ready to go.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. And let me just thank Vanessa and everyone else who was involved for the amazing Locks box that came about an hour ago. I wish I got a Locks box before every talk. Today, we're going to take up a topic that is disturbing, more than a little depressing, and yet there is not exactly a silver lining to the topic, but there's reason to be hopeful. I'm asking the not very musical question, fascism, can it happen here? And I'm going to give you my answer right off the bat. I think the chances of anything like a full-blown fascist revolution, takeover, government are virtually nil. However, what we're looking at is something that scholars call proto-fascism, the set of necessary circumstances and ferment and so on that historically has often led to full-blown fascism. I don't believe it will lead to full-blown fascism here at any time in the foreseeable future, but it's very dangerous, very destructive, very disturbing, and I hope that our conversation today will give you some of the tools that you need to keep this in your sights and to analyze what's going on. I will say more, but I'm going to add one more thing, which is that if we were having this conversation, say, 10 years ago, we would be struggling with and sort of sifting through and sorting through various scholarly definitions of fascism. What is fascism? And up until about 10, even 5 years ago, that was pretty much the scholarly approach to try to hammer out a definition. We're going to start with the guy who really is the 800-pound gorilla in the room of fascist studies, the guy who has so dominated. He's someone I admire tremendously, have listened to him speak and so on. I think he's absolutely fabulous. His name is Roger Griffin. He's from one of the colleges at Oxford, where I've been often. And in any case, he has a wonderful definition that we'll work through of fascism. But he himself would agree that the change that has happened in the scholarly community and the among the historians and political theorists and so on is for the better. Essentially, what they're doing is saying this, that there is no definition that covers all of the different circumstances, all of the different regimes, all of the different leaders, where we might be inclined to, might want to use the word fascist. Even to compare Mussolini and Hitler is to compare, in a sense, apples and oranges, or even apples and ducks. They're very, very different systems, very different approaches, very different philosophies, although they have an enormous amount in common. So in general, what I'm trying to get to here is that most scholars say, let's look at the particular circumstances. Let's compare what's comparable, and let's not agonize so much over the definitive working definition. That doesn't mean you should start without a working definition, and we're going to start with, well, eventually get to one. So having said all that, I'm going to break for a commercial, and I'm going to do that by sharing my screen and telling you a little bit about my own website, which will be useful for a couple of reasons. Let me do this here. A couple of things we have to take care of. Eventually, Zoom will be a little more user-friendly since they're making billions of dollars off of all of this. Okay, here's my website. Vanessa has put the address in chat, but it's JK. You don't need the www. It's JK Lecture Hall, Jim Kenney, but jklecturehall.net. This is a regular Zoom platform. I offer a wide range of programs. I'll tell you that the next one coming up, I'll show you a quick slide at the end of that one, begins this coming Saturday at 1 o'clock. It'll go for 4 weeks, and it's called The 50s and the 60s. From golden years to days of hope and rage. It's really, I think, it's a really good program, and you'll be intrigued. It's not that the 60s and 50s are so very, very different, but rather that the 50s set the stage for the ferment and revolution in the 60s. And I think it will really not only be a nice nostalgic experience for most of us, but it will be a very informative one. But the reason I'm telling you about all this, here's the welcome page. You go to jklecturehall.net. Here's where you land. If you can follow my cursor here, go there under home. Now I can't click this because it's just a picture, but under home, if you scroll down, you'll get to resource library. And if you click it, this will open. There's the resource library. And the very first thing, I just put it in this morning, is a handout. It's just a single PDF, and it has about 16 of the slides that you'll see today. All the better, more interesting ones are right there for you on a PDF in full color. You can just open it and print them out, and I hope that will be a convenience. As we go through the slides, you can relax and not try to take so many notes. And here's just the display slide for the workshop that begins on Saturday. Golden years, from the golden years of the 50s to the days of hope and rage. Was it the best of times or the worst? Both sides, left and right, are nostalgic about the period. The right tends to be nostalgic about the 50s. The left tends to be nostalgic about the 60s. And they both suffer from what I call nostalgic myopia or historical myopia. They don't quite see it the way it was. They don't quite see clearly. Okay, enough of the commercials. I said some of this is going to be a little depressing. I don't see this in our future, but it does provoke a little bit of thought. The one thing we can say of that these movements that we would be inclined, and without defining fascism, but movements that we would be inclined to affix that fascistic label to, or that fascist label to, have one very clear thing in common, which is that they are anti-democratic. They believe that the idea of a functioning democracy is unreasonable, it's foolish, and it's not attainable. Democracy doesn't work, and they are profoundly opposed to the idea of liberty and what goes with it, which is liberalism. You know, from the point of view, I'll just throw this in, from the point of view of political theory and political philosophy, the idea of political liberalism covers both the modern left and the modern right. Both would describe themselves as political liberals without that sort of special gloss that the word liberal gets in our own time. And a liberal is one who is first and foremost inclined to the free exchange of monies and goods and services, a liberal economy, and to a certain extent the exchange of ideas. Well, however you define liberal political system, fascists are against it. So I raised this question. I was so surprised. I was just Googling around and I found this sign and I said, well, that goes in the show. and so it does. But I added my own little question mark there because actually, no, I don't think fascism lies ahead, but we are smack dab in the middle, as I will tell you in no uncertain terms. We're smack dab in the middle of a period of very dangerous proto-fascism. All the makings are here. Can it happen here? Two books come to mind, two amazing books. One by no less than Sinclair Lewis. He published this back in 1935. It is actually a terrific book. It holds up. If you were to pick this up today, and you could very easily on Amazon, it reads almost like a new novel. It tells the story of an interesting character, sort of a Huey Longish character, whose name is Berzelius Windrip. Berzelius Windrip, but they call him Buzz Windrip, and he gets elected president, and it's a shame when he does, because he immediately begins to model himself after Benito Mussolini. You notice that figure in the background on the book. This is, and I'll show you this more closely and more clearly, this is something that comes from actually the Etruscans and then the Romans, and it's called in Latin a fasces, F-A-S-C-E-S. This is the root, this little instrument, this large instrument actually, is the root of our word fascist. And these were born by officials of the Roman Curia, officials of the Roman court, bodyguards essentially, who attended magistrates. A magistrate in old Republican and later Imperial Rome, a magistrate was anyone who held power over a group or whatever, not just a judge, but the emperor was a magistrate, and the consuls were, and so on. And they were always accompanied by people called lictors. I'll show you that in a minute. And the lictors carried these bundles of rods. Well, the basic idea, although lictors would sometimes take out a rod to punish someone who needed it, or they would pull out their axe to punish someone who really needed punishing, but it was a symbolic thing because one rod was easy to break. But when they were all bound together in the fasces, they were impossible to break. So it's a common symbol of the will and the power of the people. So that's what that means, and I'll show you more about that. Here's the other book, and this was made into a mini-series that I'm told, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm going to, I'm told was really good. It just came out last year, and Vanessa is giving it the thumbs up, so it was good, huh?
It was fascinating. I really love the book. And of course, now there's a lot coming out about Philip Roth. Highly recommend it.
Well, I don't keep up with the latest on what's coming out about Philip Roth, but I'm sure you'll keep me informed. But anyway, this book is about the election of no less than Charles Lindbergh as President of the United States. If you know anything about Lindbergh, and I'm sure you know a lot about Lindbergh, after he finished the Lucky Lindy solo flight, he began to display a very, very different character. And he was a far-right figure in American politics. He was one of the leaders of the American isolationist movement. Why should we come to the aid of Britain? He was opposed to Lend-Lease. He was opposed to our entrance into World War II, and he thought that Herr Hitler was doing a bang-up job, and he always referred to him as Herr Hitler, which is a real red flag, was doing a bang-up job in Germany. Imagine if Charles Lindbergh became president of the United States. This is a terrific book, and I guess the miniseries is really worthwhile. I took the time this morning to look up and see where you could find it. You can get it on Amazon Prime, or on Amazon. You can rent, buy, whatever. Anyway, it's worth it. So here's that fasces I was talking about. It was originally an Etruscan symbol. Since we've never cracked the Etruscan language, we have abundant supplies of it, but we've never broken the language. We don't know exactly what this represented to them. We just know it's all over the place for them. But the Romans picked it up, and it became the symbol of the will and power of the people. I have there, oh yeah, I have both Roman Republican and Roman Imperial. And there's a sketch that reflects the way it looked in Roman times, carried by Roman lictors, and the lictor, that probably comes from the Latin word that means to tie up or to bind, which is also the root of the word religion, interestingly enough. But it was carried by these heralds and bodyguards. But it's also a very prevalent symbol that you'll find all over the place in Washington, in American institutions. It used to be on the back of the dime. And those of you who remember the Liberty Dime, remember it had a fasces on the back. I'll show you a picture of it, because for the Roosevelt Dime, they changed that fasces ever so slightly into a torch. You know, after World War II, it was no longer appropriate to have the symbol of Italian fascism on the back of our dime, so we modified it and changed it into a torch. But look, there's a classic example of the Roman fasces. Look where it hangs. This is the chamber of the House of Representatives, and they are there today, to this day. This is obviously during the presidency of Barack Obama. There's Hillary Clinton, John Roberts, and at the rostrum are John Boehner, Speaker of the House, and Joe Biden, Vice President and President pro tem of the Senate. So they're all waiting for Barack Obama to enter. But look at that. And then look at this, the seal of the Senate of the United States. 2 crossed fasces still on the seal of the Senate. I guess we figured it's just too much trouble and too expensive to get rid of them, since they're in just about every government building. And there they are. On the left is the Mercury dime, and on the right is the Roosevelt dime. You see, they haven't done that much to it, but they did light one end of it and take the axe out. So that'll do. So fascism, let me just tell you about a convention that is used by historians and scholars. If you see fascism capitalized, almost always it refers to the Italian movement that was started by Benito Mussolini. So the first fascist movement in the world that called itself fascist was Mussolini's fascism. If we're talking about Nazi fascism, or over here, here's Hitler greeting Francisco Franco, who also was a self-anointed fascist, but his regime very different from the other two. You see the difficulty of defining it. But when we are talking about Hitler or Franco or just generic fascism, we tend not to capitalize it. I know that doesn't mean much, but the role of the fascist leader is all important. So I decided to talk about that just a little bit. I'm talking about it especially with regard to the Nazi fascism. And Hitler was defined what he called the Führerprinzip, which obviously translates into the leader principle, And the leader principle boiled down to this: the word of the Führer is above all written law. The word of der Führer is above all written law. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one nation, one leader. And also I wanted to point out that fascism is, wherever you find it, it's essentially anti-parliamentary. And that makes the leader absolutely essential. You may have, by the way, if there's anyone here who thinks that Donald Trump was the best thing to happen to politics since sliced bread, you've come to the wrong place, because I think he skirts the narrow edge of fascism. I think Donald Trump is the closest we've ever gotten to a fascist leader at the top. And if you think about the Trumpians who are left behind in the congressional GOP, and I'm not talking about mainstream, Main Street Republicans, many of whom are horrified by all of this, but I am talking about the GOP congressional delegation that is overwhelmingly Trumpian. Do you know that 142 members of the GOP congressional delegation, House members and Senate members alike, voted not to accept, voted to overturn the electoral count, to overturn the results of the election? That's really extraordinary. That anti-democratic, that again, scholars would refer to it as an anti-parliamentary spirit. And one of the measures seems to me, of fascist legislatures is that they don't seem to be very inclined to pass legislation. Instead, they're inclined simply to follow in lockstep the will of the leader. And that certainly has been the pattern recently in Washington. I have no tolerance for those who say the problem with bipartisanship is that the two sides won't cooperate. No, the problem with bipartisanship is that the one side has no interest in legislation. And that is classic fascist or proto-fascist attitude, because essentially we are anti-parliamentary. We're not interested in all this stuff. We want to proclaim, we want to make statements, and above all, we want to get on Hannity. That's the way Marjorie Taylor Greene approaches her role in government, or Lauren Boebert. Make a fuss, say something outrageous, get on Fox News, and then continue, rinse and repeat, and start the same thing the next day. Here are just a few lines from Donald Trump's 2016 convention speech. He said, "The nation's in crisis." You remember this. "I am your voice." And this is the classic one. "I alone can fix it. I alone can fix it." Can you hear Mussolini saying something like that? Well, Mussolini said exactly that on many occasions. "And I will restore law and order." This is straight out of the Mussolini playbook. A lot of people have compared Donald Trump to Hitler. That is, I think, a mistake. A much more invidious and scary comparison is with Benito Mussolini. Quoted here, "If only we can give them the faith that mountains can be moved, they'll accept the illusion that mountains are movable, and thus an illusion may become reality." I don't need to add anything to that. Here's from a really excellent Argentinian scholar, and this is from a book called A Very Short Introduction to Fascism. He also wrote a book, this is called A Brief History of Fascist Lies. Just a very little book available on Kindle or in hard copy. It's terrific summary, just published last year. He's from Argentina. His name is Federico Finkelstein. And he says this, I'm going to read it because it might be tricky for somebody to read. "Fascism was not a simple and hypocritical lie, but a lived and believed experience." Not just a lie, hypocritical lie, but lived and believed experience, both from above and below, from the leader level and from the level of the followers. In fascism, fiction displaced reality, and it became a reality. For non-believers, people outside, these fascist fantasies could and can only be considered false positions, inauthentic claims on the nature of politics. But the opposite is true for the fascists. This guy is terrific. He also wrote a book called From Fascism to Populism, which is terrific. I'll be talking more about populism. So what are the big lies today? And we're going to touch on something here that I'm going to be hammering on all the way through. As far as I'm concerned, you want to understand what's broken on the far right. When I'm not just talking about the right. I'm not talking about fiscal conservatism or the idea that it's better to let the private sector handle things than government. That basic sense that government screws things up when it gets its hands all over things. That's all sane and safe, and we need the two sides. We need at the center. We need a center left and a center right. Center left that says I want an activist state, and the center right that says, well, watch it when you get into an activist state. Let's let the private sector handle as much as we can. Those are two perfectly reasonable and necessary positions. They counterbalance each other. They sort of fend each other off, and they can work together as they did through much of our political history. But I'm talking about the extreme right wing that absolutely dominates the GOP congressional delegation. I mean, the overwhelming majority of GOP members of the House and of the Senate. And they are dominated by three principal obsessions, if you will. And we'll talk about what those are. They are science denial. And let me say something I'm going to say again and again, or I would like to, which is, of the three that I'm going to talk about, the most important, far and away, the one thing you must understand if you want to understand modern proto-fascism or the risk or the danger of fascism in American culture, what animates the far right wing, number one is science denial. It's not a peripheral anti-Fauci thing. It's number one. Climate change denial, denial of evolution, COVID denial, you go right on down the list, and science denial has become the backbone of right-wing populism. If, after all, you believe that we need to accept and rely on the great wisdom of the ordinary common people, they know more than all your experts, all your scientists, what George Wallace used to call your pointy-headed professors, and he did say professor. If you want to rely on them, fine, but experts should not be trusted, expertise should not be trusted, and if you take that position in defense of populism, the wisdom of the people, then you got to start by throwing out science, and by golly, they do. They do. We've never seen the like of it before. Hand in hand, and it might not seem hand in hand, but it is, with science denial, is xenophobia. That's from the Greek. Xenos is the Greek word for stranger. Xenophobia is just the fear and hatred of strangers. So essentially, what form do we encounter xenophobia in every single day, especially if we pay attention to the noise from the right and from the proto-fascists? We encounter it in the form of white supremacy. And hand in hand with white supremacy is anti-Semitism. And I would like to point out that hand in hand with anti-Semitism is Islamophobia. Scratch an anti-Semite and you find someone who hates Muslims too. And that's why the estrangement between Jews and Muslims is a very disturbing and very worrisome thing to me. But we won't get into that anymore today. Science denial, xenophobia, and what do you suppose comes next? If you guessed conspiracy theories, you're right. And these three fit together like a glove. For example, or like, it's not a very good metaphor. A glove doesn't fit together. Anyway, if you know something about racial theory, you know that no geneticist today, the overwhelming minority of anthropologists and scholars and students of culture and so on ever even used the term race. The term race is out. It's gone. It's discarded. It's not worth anything to the conversation. Yes, we can say someone is of this race or another race, but do you understand that the metrics we refer to when we're saying so-and-so belongs to this race or that race are all skin deep? They're all skin deep, and for the most part, they are all head things. Skin color, facial features, and hair texture. That's all we got to go on when we talk about race. And the idea that there is some correlation between skin color, let's just stick to that, skin color and IQ, totally false. The correlation between skin color and morality, false. A correlation between skin color and stick-to-itiveness, false. Between skin color and basic predisposition to health or illness, false. And even this one, which is always surprising to people, there is no correlation between skin color and athletic ability. None whatsoever. So if I know your race, I have to put it in air quotes, you know. If I know your race, I know nothing else about you. I know you have skin of this tone and that tone and that tone. I know you might have these or those facial features and hair texture, but that's it. That's all I know. So to be a racist, you have to be in denial of the science that has for nearly a century told us there's nothing going on when you talk about race. Certainly a half a century, it's been crystal clear that race tells us absolutely nothing about the individuals. So to be a racist, well, you already knew this. To be a racist, you have to be pretty ignorant, but science ignorant as well. And conspiracy theories that are on the web, oh, you wouldn't believe some of the things that people believe, some of the things that are believed by sitting members of Congress that are part of this whole conspiracy theory web. And every single one that I might be inclined to bring up, I won't today, but boy, I could go on for hours about wacky conspiracy theories. Every single one is rooted in a denial of science. And when and where does American science denial begin? It's worth a mention. I'm not going to explore it further, but it begins with evangelical Christians. And it begins, the denial of science is lifted up in defense of the biblical idea of creation against the theory of evolution. So the first great threat that was presented by the educated world, by the scholarly world, by the academic world, by the scientific world to Christian belief in the view of evangelicals and fundamentalists was the teaching of evolution. And that's when they knew that science was the enemy, and they haven't stopped since. So a good rule of thumb is if you know someone is a dyed-in-the-wool evangelical or fundamentalist, yes, they're likely to be evolution deniers, but also climate change deniers. And the chances are very, very good that they deny or are suspicious about the whole corona COVID connection, and very high likelihood of vaccine denial. Do you know that it's the belief is widespread on what we call the alt-right or the alternate right, that the disease was created by Bill Gates, funded by George Soros, of course. I mean, there has to be a wealthy European Jew in the mix in order for these people to be convinced, as if Bill Gates needs funding from George Soros. That's odd. But the disease was begun by Bill Gates researchers. And the whole idea was to enable him to develop a vaccine, make a huge amount of money selling the vaccine. Apparently he controls all the companies that are developing vaccines. But the real reason is that every vaccine shot contains a microchip that goes into your body and identifies your location. A lot of people believe that it identifies and transmits direct to Bill Gates, not only your location, but also your activity, your thoughts, and so on. These people don't know enough to realize that a microchip in the body needs a power source. And the power source would have to be a whole lot bigger than could fit in a vaccine. But they're not concerned about all of that. That's widely believed. Crazy conspiracy theories. So here are some of the big lies that are surrounding us today. First, the steal. The 2020 election was stolen. Joe Biden didn't win. Donald Trump won. No evidence of that. But the claim, of course, is made that there was massive, widespread voter fraud. Hundreds of court cases have been set up and proposed. 60 at least have been argued and ruled on. And of those 60, in not one case was any evidence presented that said there was voter fraud. Just anecdotal stories. Somebody saw something. Somebody saw a truck pull up outside a place where votes were being counted and take some boxes inside. Well, that's clear voter fraud. Anyway, of those 61 cases, I think only one resulted in a judgment that was at all friendly to the voter fraudster people, and that was simply a decision by a lower court that said, yes, the observers from the Republican Party could stand closer. They'd been told to stand 15 feet away. They were allowed to stand 8 feet away, and that's the only decision they got. Every other case was thrown out of court. No evidence of voter fraud, and yet now all over the country, state legislatures are passing laws to restrict voting, restrict polling places, especially in the neighborhoods where the fraud was most egregious, supposedly, and those are neighborhoods where black and brown people are found. Cities, to wit. Do you know there are over 300 pieces of legislation, according to the ACLU, and this is as of April 1st, 300 pieces of legislation pending or passed in state legislatures. The idea that Antifa is really responsible for the January 6th insurrection, those weren't Trump supporters. They were Antifa people dressed up as Trump supporters. The idea that we are plagued by fake news, fake history, fake science, all of this is part of the texture of the big lie. And fascism always, always, always trades in some fundamental set of lies. Nazi fascism, Jews are responsible for everything that has ever gone wrong in Germany. and I don't have to tell you any more about that. How about this? The COVID hoax. This is a hoax. The numbers of dead. Kristi Noem, who's the Republican governor of South Dakota, hit particularly hard by all of this, says the numbers are totally inflated. A few months ago, she was saying it's not, back when it was 400,000, she said it's not 400,000, it's closer to 10,000 dead. Just declares that, just asserts it. And then there are the anti-vaxxers. But you know what's at the heart of it all? What's at the heart of it all is race. Racism, pure and simple. The deep fear that is held by most of these people that something like white genocide is underway by assimilation to take away what has made us the great nation in a complex nation. The white people. America's a white country. By white, of course, we mean what? We mean more than just white. We mean white, male, and Christian. That's what we mean when we say white. Don't forget the male, because the white supremacist is as much a misogynist usually, and anti-Semite, and Islamophobe as he is a racist. White genocide, a theory that was at first advanced by a French philosopher named Renaud Camus, who's still alive and still churning this stuff out, called Le Grand Remplacement, which means the great replacement. And here's the idea, won't surprise you a bit. Who's in charge? Who's organizing it? Oh, it's George Soros and a group of wealthy Jews and left-wingers. And the idea is to replace white people with people of color. And you do that by eliminating restrictions on immigration and so on, replacing the white people. So people who have never had an unprivileged day in their life are terrified that their privileges are being, in an orchestrated way, taken away from them. First, they're told they have to respect women and maybe even work for one. And then the next day they go to work and their boss is not only a woman, but a black woman. And the day after that, they discover that she's a black woman Muslim, and their world comes tumbling down. And what's at the heart of it all? Racism. If there is proto-fascism percolating in America, it is first and foremost a white supremacist movement. It's a racist movement. It's a movement that is animated by fear of the loss of white privilege. And there's three who churn it out every day: Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, and Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson looks like he's having a thought. But I wouldn't worry about that. It's unlikely. I can joke about Tucker Carlson, but I'll tell you this right now, and you remember where you heard it. If he's not a major candidate for president in 2024, I will eat my hat. I don't have one, but I'll get one. Their reaction that we see here is to the Derek Chauvin trial, the conviction of this policeman. And Tucker Carlson saying, this guy is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. So who's going to be protecting us on the streets? Who's going to be protecting you? If we start convicting policemen now, what's next? What's next? Racial fear. Racial fear. That's what we're selling. So a little bit more about these three toxic energies. If you take nothing else away, and again, you'll have all these handouts like this one, which I think is pretty explanatory. If you take nothing else away from our conversation, remember these three elements of proto-fascism, of the set of circumstances that produced the Capitol insurrection, that are producing this terror in state legislatures all over the country that are desperately trying to shut down voting by poorer people, older people, college students, and especially black and brown people, terrified and trying to shut it down. Well, at the heart of things in the populist echo chamber are three toxic energies. And number one, you already know, is science denial. Number two is xenophobia. And number three is conspiracy theory. I love this little slide. I labored over it lovingly. Anyway, here's my picture of, what is the issues in the echo chamber are all lost causes. Let me just tell you a word about that very loaded phrase. The Lost Cause was a book that was written in 1866 by a Confederate Army officer. And essentially he said, we lost even though we shouldn't have lost. Ours was the nobler cause. Ours was by far the more refined, more genteel, more educated, finer society. We were by far the better fighting men. We were cavaliers. We were the better horsemen, and so on. We were beaten by northern industrial might, and look what that industrial might has cost the North. It's cost it its culture. It never had any gentility. The North is a place of brigands and thugs and slaves that are treated much, much more poorly than our family slaves are treated. We were the noble cause, and once again, one day, the South will prevail. And that idea of the lost cause is still absolutely with us today, and I would say a very significant majority of those who stormed the Capitol were in one way or another enamored of the lost cause. The lost cause is what has kept the Ku Klux Klan and related movements going for years. Okay, the lost cause. So here are some examples of lost causes. I'm going to show you this blown up, and as I say, I'm giving you this handout, but just a few. Populist nationalism, homegrown terrorism, far more acts of violent terrorism in the United States since 9/11, far, far, far more carried out by white supremacists than carried out by any sort of left-wing group, very few there, and by any sort of Muslim group. This is the source of terrorism in the United States, white supremacist nationalism. What they call the alt-right, that's this new phase of and face of the right. Fake news. I mean their fake news, not their claims of fake news, but their fake news, their fake history. For example, good example of fake history is the claim, widespread in this proto-fascist group, that the founding fathers, our founders, were, to a man, evangelical Christians. Well, you know, evangelical Christianity hadn't even been fully fledged yet, so they certainly weren't evangelical Christians. The idea of the separation of church and state, we're told, is a myth. Jefferson never said it. Madison never said it. They wrote about it extensively, but that's all to be ignored. Fake science. Anthony Fauci is the devil's pawn. He lies about absolutely everything. And the big lies, these are the big lies promulgated by them. We just went through some of them. QAnon. This, if you don't know about QAnon, find out. QAnon, this absolutely bizarre movement that suggests that the global sex traffic, the global traffic in pedophilia, also, let's throw in the global drug traffic and every other kind of nefarious global trafficking that might be going on. It's all controlled by guess who? By the Democratic Party. Oh, but we don't, on the right, we don't say Democratic anymore. That's too polite. We say the Democrat Party. We say the Democrat Party. And that is what has funded the global sex trade, has funded the Democrat Party for the last 30 years. It was most recently headed by Hillary Clinton, and now it's Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer who are in charge. Part of the rumor that came from QAnon was that global sex trade and drug trade and everything trade that you can imagine was controlled from a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor. Yes, it's this strange, called Comet Ping Pong. Comet Ping Pong. The initials are CP. Well, of course, that stands for child pornography. But from the basement of Comet Ping Pong. Comet Ping Pong is this little ramshackle place. It doesn't have a basement. But that didn't stop some yahoo from North Carolina from loading up his AR-15 and coming to Washington to conduct what he told police later was a private investigation of this situation to rescue children. QAnon has now started an organization stealing the name from another reputable organization, calling it Save the Children, because the children are being stolen away by Democrats and sold abroad. And there's more. This guy, by the way, shot up the place. Thank God he didn't shoot anyone, and he's resting comfortably now somewhere. But another thing that QAnon claims is that these same Democrats who control all of the pedophilia and drug trade and so on are also cannibals. They are Satan-worshiping cannibals, and they consume the flesh of some of these children. There's a wing of this movement that says not only that, but they are actually people from outer space. They are lizard people from outer space. That traces back to a sci-fi, a one-season sci-fi show that some of you might recall called V, in which the supposedly benign invaders that came to Earth and brought us new science and all sorts of things were actually feeding off our race. And when they would take off their hoods, they would be revealed as lizards. That's where the lizard people thing came from. And these people believe it. And there are three of them in Congress, 3 Q supporters. And then, of course, one of my favorites is what I just call covidiocy. Covidiocy. The disease is fake. The numbers are fake. Bill Gates started the whole thing because he wants to inject you with a microchip. The vaccines aren't tested and won't work, and so on. That's the latest manifestation. It would be just silly and funny. You'd give it a Darwin Award because that herd is going to be thinned by its own idiocy if it weren't for the fact that they are imperiling, even now, people that refuse to get the vaccine are putting at risk our achievement of herd immunity. So these are some of the things. And all of it adds up to what? The climate, the set of attitudes of proto-fascism. You can't understand proto-fascism without starting with science denial, moving to xenophobia, and then moving on to conspiracy theory. It's an ugly kind of populism. And there's the blow-up, just so you can see. And the Capitol insurrection, which was, in a sense, the Capitol insurrection, you could say, was the most recent scream of the echo chamber. It's our poisonous subculture. And how in God's name did we end up with such a poisonous subculture? It's a subculture indeed. The numbers are very small, but you've seen how loud they are and potentially how dangerous they are. Just think of the anti-vax threat. Think of the fact that there are at the moment 3 members of Congress, and that these people, these Q supporters, are getting elected to local office, local school boards, and so on, under the radar all around us. So what is fascism? Now here we get a little bit academic, and the going briefly gets a little bit heavier. This is my favorite guy. This is Roger Griffin. Nobody knows more about him. Nobody's a better teacher. His classes at Oxford Brookes University, you know that Oxford is made up of lots of little universities and colleges, and this is one of the really little ones, but his classes are packed. People from all the other colleges come to hear him lecture about fascism. He's such a good teacher. You can find him all over YouTube, just Roger Griffin. Just go to YouTube and on their search engine, search Roger Griffin Fascism and search for a program that's about the length you feel like watching. And you will love what this guy has to say and you'll learn a lot. He has 3 things to say about fascism. Fascism is at its mythic core, he says, at its mythic core, because there's a great story always, a myth, always at the center of fascism, a story that points at a larger truth. That's what a myth is. And that myth is what he calls palingenesis. Palingenesis. Don't get hung up here, but palingenesis from the Greek, palin, not pronounced palin, although, but palingenesis means again, born again, born again. Genesis, of course, birth and that kind of thing. But palingenetic means rebirth. So always at the core of fascism is some sort of rebirth story, like ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. But what was the rebirth story of the Nazis? The rebirth story was the reclaiming of the greatness of the vanished Aryan people. A myth. I mean, the Aryan people, there's a wonderful story that Himmler sent an SS major to India because his own researchers had said that the Aryan people who had come originally from the steppes and seeded the Celtic people and the Germanic people and so on, that the remnant of them had ended up in India. And so he sent this SS major with some troops to India to find these real Aryans and maybe bring one back. And he found Aryan people in India. Trouble is that they were exceedingly black. So the historical record doesn't tell us what happened to this major when he came back and reported to Himmler. I wouldn't have wanted to be in his shoes. Now that may be apocryphal, but it tells the story. But anyway, palingenetic, some old false story. For Mussolini, you know what it was? It was the Roman Empire. What's the greatness we want to bring back? The Roman Empire. Recep Erdogan, who is the increasingly fascistic dictator of Turkey, constantly refers to the greatness that was the Ottoman Empire, even though the last almost 3 centuries of the Ottoman Empire were descended into corruption and chaos and insanity. But anyway, he wants to bring back the greatness of the Ottomans, and closer to home, it's make America great again. What great period are you referring to? That's the nice thing about myths. You don't have to specify. You just point. We aren't great anymore. If you are a white person who feels that he has lost his privilege, if you're a white Christian male who feels that his maleness is threatened, his Christianity is undervalued, and his whiteness is in danger of being genocidally submerged, then you might think, okay, we do need to go back to a time when America was great. And what would be that time? When white male Christians ran the show. Now, the idea that you can't possibly retrace those steps, I mean, patriarchy is not gone, but it's not going to come back. Anybody that believes it will, I have patriarchy futures I'd be glad to sell you, but, don't be silly. It's not coming back. The idea of white supremacy, you can be a white supremacist, but white supremacy is not returning. Right? The idea of a Christian-dominated American state. Christians are still the majority. They still got the lion's share of power, but a Christian-dominated state that makes no bones about it when it writes laws and that sort of thing, that's gone, And so if that's the way you feel, if that's what's been lost, then maybe you're going to be drawn to someone who comes along and speaks to you in code and says, we're going to make America great again. We're going to make America white again. So first thing that you have to know is that fascism is always palingenetic. It's always got a mythic tale of some previous state that we have to return to. Second is it's ultra-nationalist, which is just a way of saying we are the ones. We, and what's the subtext there? We, white Christian males, are the ones, and we are the nation that matters. This is our country. This is our nation. Nationalism is always an us against them thing. It's underway in India under Narendra Modi, who says very openly, look, India is for Hindus. It's not for Jains or Buddhists or Christians, and it's certainly not for Muslims. That's nationalism. Ultranationalism is complete intolerance for the other, and that's one of the hallmarks, without a doubt, of fascism. So ultranationalism, and what does it all come down to? Populism. So it's palingenetic, ultranationalist populism. What's populism? Populism, in a nutshell, let me say this. There was a time, we could go back to the early 20th century, and someone like William Jennings Bryan, who was with the America Party, the America Populist Party, and his notion was to help, his political mission was to help unfortunate people who were bruised and battered at the hands of the East Coast elite, who were, and there really was an East Coast elite. Who were they? They were the ones that owned vast stretches of America. They controlled the railroads. They controlled the markets. They controlled the stockyards. They controlled everything. And the people that Brian took up with, who were oppressed, were for the most part Western farmers and miners who couldn't get their ore to market without loss, who couldn't get their produce to market without loss because the markets and the railroads were controlled, and so on. He fought for them. Populism actually meant something. It really did mean looking out for the needs of people less fortunate. But that didn't last very long. After Brian, we started to see figures like Huey Long, who was much more interested in his own stock, and Father Charles Coughlin, who started out as a Roosevelt supporter and found out there was much more money and power and influence in being a Roosevelt hater, and appealing to the uneducated. How? Not by addressing their, and this is important, the modern day populist, since William Jennings Bryan, populism has given up the idea of appealing to the hopes and dreams of ordinary people, and instead appeals to what? Their fears and hatreds. That's what populism means today. Let me talk to you about why you're scared, and let me give you the long list of people who are responsible for the things that frighten you. There are people who are trying to take away the power and the privilege and the prestige and the honor and the history of white people and Christian people and males. Let me give you their names. You know, at the top of the list, liberals and feminists and interreligious people and so on. So, palingenetic ultranationalist populism. Today, populism, I'll say one more thing, which is that populism purports to be a bottom-up movement, a movement of the people. It never is. It's always top-down. And if you find a populist movement, the next question is, who's the demagogue? There is always a demagogue. Another Greek word. I got a lot of them today. But demagogue means leader of the people. Leader of the people. But we all know that demagogue has come to mean misleader of the people, right? And so any demagogues come to mind recently that fit our proto-fascistic mode and mood? This is Roger Griffin, and he is a genius. So there it is, palingenetic, ultranationalist populism. See, you're never going to forget that. You'll be whistling that tune for the rest of the day and asking people if they know what palingenetic means. A Definition of Fascism by Roger Griffin, Oxford Brookes University. So what are the ways of fascism? We're saying the same thing here, just slightly differently. Summoning up a mythic past, okay? A mythic past when we were in charge. It's always like that. A mythic past when we Aryans, a mythic past when we Ottomans, a mythic past when we Romans, a mythic past when we white American Confederates. Let's face that. You know, what's the root of all this? It's the lost cause. It is the lost cause of the Confederacy that is coming home to roost. It's no accident that all over the Capitol insurrection, there were Confederate flags waving. It's an ultranationalist creed, which is always us versus them. That's easy to sell, by the way. If people feel down, if people feel economically threatened, if they feel that a secular world is closing in on them and their religion, they're going to be inclined to accept that us versus them thing. And here comes the demagogue, the misleader of the people, and he says to the populace, I alone can fix it. You've come to the right place. And then you stir in a little bit of post-truth. Post-truth. The post-truth era began when Sean Spicer took the microphone at that first press conference and said, we saw the inaugural crowd of President Trump, larger than any inaugural crowd in history and larger by far than Obama's first inauguration. Totally false. And the thing is that there were pictures. pictures and videos, and the web was flooded with them saying, no, here's Trump's crowd, and there is Obama's crowd, which could have swallowed Trump's 10 times over. And then the post-truth era got its next big step when Kellyanne Conway said, there are facts and there are alternative facts. Anyway, post-truth and conspiracy voodoo, and what does it mean? It means we're going to launch full-scale attacks on science, expertise, and the media. Did Mussolini do that? Big time. Did Hitler do that? Full on. Absolutely. By the way, Hitler, like some of our own proto-fascists and Mussolini, were not at all opposed to technology. They were happy with technology. They just weren't comfortable with theoretical science. Okay, so here's the big question. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we really even headed there? I'm going to just pause and say, I don't think we are. We're not headed to a fascist takeover. I don't see the possibility of a full-blown fascist government in the United States in the foreseeable future. But here's the simple answer, which is that proto-fascism is a minority movement, but it's already very well established in the United States. And if you doubt, there it is. That's proto-fascism. So how did we get down this rabbit hole, says Alice. By the way, I meant to see if I could find out the name of that cat. Does anybody know the name of Alice's cat? If you do, type it in chat, because I'd like to know. But how do we get down this rabbit hole? This time the cat's gone, but the rabbit is with us. Down the rabbit hole, and what's the characteristic of the rabbit hole? Science denial and xenophobia and conspiracy theory. I can't stress that enough. That's what ails us. And by the way, what do you suppose is the engine that really drives science denial, xenophobia, conspiracy theory, and proto-fascism? Social media. And there are 5 channels on social media that are particularly responsible for this, that have enabled it. Facebook, YouTube, Google, Instagram, and Twitter. Facebook, YouTube, Google, Instagram, and Twitter. People think that Instagram, Instagram, it's so nice. You share pictures of the picnic. And who doesn't share those little square pictures on Instagram? I, for one, don't. But Instagram, if you dig in a little bit, is a repository of some of the ugliest and vilest stuff that you can find on the internet. And I'm not talking pornography. That's there aplenty. Less concerned with that, actually, than with the images of hate that abound on Instagram, which is, of course, owned by Facebook. Okay, this is a little bit complicated. That's why I make sure that this handout is available to you. Remember, go to jklecturehall.net. The address is in chat. Vanessa has typed it there. You land on the home page, and up at the top, there's a tab that says Home. Hit Home and scroll down to Resource Library. You get to Resource Library, and the very first thing there is this one handout that has about 16 slides for this class, for fascism. By the way, there are dozens of other handouts from other classes and workshops, and you're welcome. Take anything that you'd like. And while you're there, look around and maybe check into the one that starts this Saturday on the 50s and 60s. Anyway, we're on the way. We're asking the musical question, what's proto-fascism? How do we get there? I'll tell you, it absolutely starts, let me go back, with the other, my experience of the other. I wake up and realize that there is otherness happening in my little cocoony culture. There are other races, there are other religions, there are other colors, there are other genders intruding into my, and I can't say this enough, into my white, male, Christian world. So the other. And what does the other cause in me? Identity crisis. Well, wait a minute. I was told that being white male Christian was my ticket. And now it turns out maybe it's not such a ticket. As soon as identity crisis begins to percolate, I am vulnerable to proto-fascism. Now, the rest of what I'm going to show you here, in some order, but in order that's clear to me, but these are just things that are happening, part of the whole picture. If you're really interested in studying it, study it when you can get the handout. But for now, just let it wash over you. So from the discovery of the other to identity crisis, we also live in a time of economic insecurity. That doesn't help. We live in a time in which it feels to a lot of people like we're becoming more and more secular all the time. Just think about the content of the movies and popular culture. It seems like we're moving away from traditional American values. I would have to say some of the traditional American values we're moving away from, thank God. We're moving away from patriarchy. We're moving away from racism. We're moving away from an extraordinary tolerance for injustice. We're moving away from absolutely suicidal disregard of the health of our ecosystem and our planet. We're moving away from things that we need to leave behind. But for some people, that all adds up to secularization, the culture of the experts and the liberals, and it's scary. And that makes me cling even more to my religious exclusivism. Proto-fascism has hit America hardest in the ranks of the religious exclusivist, in the ranks of the fundamentalist. And I would say, by the way, that this has hit very hard among fundamentalist or ultra-Orthodox Jews. I'm not just talking about the Haredim, in Israel. I'm talking about ultra-conservative Jews in America. The same thing is true of not ordinary Muslims, but very, very conservative or fundamentalist Muslims have been hit very hard and are as likely to be found in the ranks of this proto-fascism as some of the others. By the way, the Hasidic community in some of the neighborhoods of New York is profoundly anti-vax, right? They will not do the vaccine. And the same thing is true of ultra-conservative Muslims. So religious exclusivism becomes a sort of incubator for proto-fascist attitudes. And it all adds up. It's more secular. We got economic insecurity. There are all these strangers around. I'm being asked to deal with people I've never dealt with in my life. And on top of that, I'm taking orders from a black Muslim woman. I mean, it's too crazy. And so cultural confusion abounds. And by the way, one of the things that's going to pop up in the upper left-hand corner before too long is the pandemic. If it weren't awful enough, now we're living in a time of pandemic. How much worse does that make? Cultural confusion. And then out of all of this, and especially out of cultural confusion, comes this, what I've been calling conspiracy theory. Here I got a little more dramatic, and I called it conspiracy voodoo. That's after a wonderful book by David Abrama something, I've forgotten his name, but it's a fabulous book called Conspiracy Voodoo. Conspiracy Voodoo, maybe about 8 or 10 years old, but worth the read. Anyway, from conspiracy voodoo, populism, and science denial. Science denial. This is a populist movement we're living through, and you can't have populism without science denial. I know that seems like a leap, but think about it this way. You people are the experts. Ordinary, common people. Trust the wisdom of the farmer. Trust the wisdom, the better off, or it's better to listen to the wisdom of a person who's not been contaminated by reading any books. That's pure wisdom. Anybody that believes that will believe anything. And of course, that's the idea. That's the idea. So if I'm saying all wisdom inheres in the common person, and especially in the common man, I got no time for science. And that's sort of a shorthand for saying I got no time for experts. Experts need not apply. I don't need your Faucis. And it's a short step from there, populism, conspiracy voodoo, science denial, to xenophobia. Somebody must be doing all this. Right? The culture's in a mess. Our old strictures are breaking down. Somebody's doing it. Somebody's responsible. It must be the liberals. It must be the feminists. It must be the environmentalists. And who's bankrolling it? Well, can we guess? It's George Soros. And that summons up, once you've got a populist movement, you're calling for a demagogue, and a demagogue will always step up. Once the demagogue steps up, we're talking authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, again, short step from all of these. Don't worry about the order of these things. It's just the way it struck me. Ultranationalism. Just this profound, intense us versus them. And at a certain point, when I get intense enough about my populist ultranationalism, I want to sign up. And that's where the militancy comes in. Yes, hell yes, count me in on the invasion of the Capitol. Count me in for a violent demonstration. Count me in. You have a plan to kidnap and execute the governor of Michigan because she has shut down the state. I'm there. I'm a militant. And all of this adds up to groupthink, doesn't it? Groupthink. And the leader cult. The leader cult. We are privileged to be able, as students of human nature, we're privileged in a strange way to be able to watch the unfolding, the development, the peaking, and I believe, the denouement, the dissolution, the dissolving of a leader cult. We're seeing it right before our eyes. Part and parcel of all of this is that my ultranationalism, my militancy, my xenophobia makes me more and more tolerant of a master race democracy. Democracy for us, but not for you. We're going to cut down polling places in cities and in areas where more and more people of color live because we don't want you participating in our democratic system. Simple as that. Over 300 laws aimed at doing that, either already on the books or pending in state legislatures around the country. 42 states. By the way, it's interesting that of the remaining 18 states, 9 or perhaps 11 of them have done the opposite. They have taken steps to make voting more liberal, more full-time, voting holidays, and so on. And there's the pandemic sticking in up there at the upper left. So here's the last point to make. When you live in a time of uncertainty, I'm just going to assert this, and some people may want to quibble, but the data is there. You don't have to trust me, except for the fact that I'm right. Uncertainty almost always precipitates a movement to the right, not to the left. The more uncertain the times, economically, culturally, you name it, the more likely people are to move to the right, and from there toward extremism. And that's what we're seeing. There's the fabulous cover of the New Yorker on January 18th. After the January 6th insurrection, the Capitol building in the background says it all, as do these shots. I'll tell you a little bit about them in a moment. Look at the one in the center. Day 1 versus day 1448. This is Donald Trump's inauguration. You see there almost the entire crowd. That's the inauguration. His speech, you may recall, was called American Carnage. Here's day 1448, which is American Carnage writ large. Here's this guy waving the Trump is my president flag, and interestingly enough, he's right below the landing where a great painting hangs that celebrates Francis Scott Key's writing of what became our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, Fort McHenry, the battle in the War of 1812. And he's pointing at the fact that our banner still waves. He's been through the night, and nobody knew whose flag would be flying over the fort. Well, it was the American flag. One comforting thing is that a lot of these people that you see here, this guy carrying the first ever Confederate battle flag on the grounds of the Capitol, I would tell you who all these people are, but don't have time. But all of these people, with the exception of Ashley down at the bottom here, who is the young woman that was killed, after she smashed the glass and was climbing through into the speaker's lobby. And a very frightened young Capitol policeman did exactly what he'd been instructed to do, and he fired. And hers was one of the lives lost. The most egregious picture of all is this creep who's wearing a sweatshirt that does indeed say Camp Auschwitz. On the back, it says staff, if you can believe it. And underneath, you can't make this out, it says work makes you free, or work brings freedom, over the camp. Arbeit macht frei, work brings freedom, or makes you free. It's completely outrageous. But that is insurrection. It is absolutely sedition. In the view of most legal scholars, this behavior is treasonous. It's certainly sedition. But what's going on here? The other, identity crisis, proto-fascism, groupthink, leader cult. Think that sums it up pretty well? Well, here's another little graphic. Demagoguery, right? Remember, the demagogue speaks to the populace and says, I want to talk to you about your fears and your hatreds. That produces fascism. The whole thing amounts to sedition. What is sedition? Sedition is inciting people to overthrow, hinder, or delay the operations of government. Do you think that fits what was going on that day? Delay? Like, no, you're not going to make a count. And we're, by the way, going to hang Mike Pence if we find him. And that leads to insurrection, and the next step or the next stage is civil war. There again, I think the chances of a civil war are nil, but boy, it's the feeling, isn't it? What is sedition? We'll just jump through this really quickly. Put down, destroy by force, overthrow, but what's important is hinder, delay, or prevent the execution of any laws. And although this wording talks about force, historically the courts have held that sedition is a matter of speech. And you know where I'm pointing with this. Did Donald Trump's speech to the crowd, did it amount to sedition? Not just his speech to the crowd, but everything he had to say about the election being stolen and so on. We have to stop this. We have to find the courage. I hope the vice president will have the courage to stop it and so on. If that's not seditious speech, I don't know. It is actually seditious speech, but not all seditious speech is illegal. That's the problem. Is this insurrection? No question. Resisting the authority of the U.S. That includes striking a Capitol policeman who's saying, no, you can't go in there. That's absolutely insurrection. And anyone convicted would further be unable to hold public office. We're going to, just because of time, we're going to skip through the sedition and move on just to one of our very last slides, which is this. If this hasn't been depressing enough, I got just a little bit more to ruin your day, and then I got a bit of a lift. First of all, should we be worried about this? The stolen election narrative. Obviously, do you think it's fanning the flames? But here's the scary part. Is it setting the stage for the next presidential election? When we say, oh, look, it was stolen again. And on the books, in addition to voter suppression legislation, is a whole raft of laws, several of which have already become law in Georgia, are pending in Arizona, pending in Texas, pending in 39 other states. Laws which would, in the case of a dispute, if somebody says, let's say the state Republican Party says this election was stolen, then the Republican-controlled legislature has, under some of these forms of legislation, would have the ability to appoint an arbiter from their own number who would replace the Secretary of State or the Commissioner of Elections or whoever is supposed to be in charge of elections and certify the results, and that person could refuse to certify, even order a new election, or simply decide how the state's electoral votes should be cast. So this is probably the scariest thing. Voter suppression, scary enough, but retinkering, redoing, recalling the election is a very real possibility. That's why passing this H.R. 1 that has passed the House, the campaign reform bill, the election reform bill, in the name of John Lewis, getting it through the Senate one way or another is so critical and is probably Democrats' number one priority. Oops. I don't know why that backed up. It's very odd. And again, it backed up. I must have, oh, I see why. My microphone is sitting on my keyboard. Let's see if the third time is the charm. Apparently not. How very odd. Bear with me. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
There we go.
The myth of voter fraud. And now we have over 300 state-level efforts in state legislatures at voter suppression. But also, and this is what I was talking about, the rejection of dubious results. That's something to worry about. But don't think that nobody's on the case. The ACLU is on the case. Bipartisan groups of people are very much on the case, who Republicans as well, who don't want to see our elections decided this way. If you opt for this kind of solution and meddling, it can backfire, because next time the other team may be in charge. This is something that I find deeply disturbing, that anyone would believe that the mobs assaulting the Capitol were Antifa. Right? It's a stunning sort of thing. And finally, the viral spread of COVIDiocy. It's Bill Gates and George Soros, but they're threatening us with herd immunity. Last slide. This is a guy who's a friend of mine. His name is Stephen Prothero. We were both students of Buddhist philosophy and history, belonged to a lot of the same professional associations. He's written extensively about Buddhism, but like me, he's gone into being interested in culture and politics. And he makes the point in a wonderful 2015 book, Why Liberals Win the Culture Wars Even When They Lose Elections. He says, look at this. You've got cultural evolution on one side, and lost causes on the other. By the way, my color scheme, maybe you've noticed, when we're going from red to blue, I like it. When we're going from blue to red, I'm against it. And that's not Democrat and Republican. That's progressive versus regressive or devolutionary. So which one do you opt for? One nation or divided? Civil rights or slavery and discrimination? If you had to put money on which one's going to prevail, that's what we're talking about here. Moving beyond racism or the return of white supremacy? Gender equity or back to patriarchy? The right to choose or no abortion ever? However you feel about abortion, what's going to happen in terms of human rights and women's rights? Gay rights or homophobia? Anybody think homophobia is coming back? There's plenty left, but talk to the next generation. They're not over it. They never had it. They're not over sexism. They never suffered from it. They're not recovering from racism the way we did. They never had it. We vaccinated them well. Interreligious engagement, that's where I've spent the last 30 years of my life, or 40. Or only Christianity. What do you think? And finally, scientific literacy and confidence, or science denial. You know, you can bet on anything in Vegas. And I think that the left column represents all of the better bets. The right column, all of the worst. That science denial, by the way, should be in red. And we are done. Thanks for the few extra minutes.
Jim, as always, so fascinating. Here's a couple comments from Rabbi Sarada. From a religious perspective, populism goes all the way back to the Torah and Korach's rebellion against Moses. It also amazes me that American populists twist the teachings of Jesus into xenophobia and replacement theory. And we're wondering if the election of Obama supercharged this movement because he embodies replacement.
Yeah, first, let me start with Obama. I agree with Ike, and I'm really glad you're there. Nice to sort of see you. I saw when you joined. Glad we're in the same hyperspace. But absolutely, the election of Obama supercharged this all. And if you remember, the Tea Party movement, which has faded as a movement, but nevertheless is such an important stage in the development of the crazy Trumpian populism that we see today, the Tea Party movement went insane over Obama, calling him a communist Nazi, whatever that is. I don't even know what that's supposed to be, but the idea that suddenly you have a black president, and the next thing you know, a woman is running. A woman ran against him, but now that woman is running in her own right. Everything that we knew and held dear is falling apart. I appreciate what you're saying about the rebellion against Moses and populism. Yeah, we could find things that are analogous to modern populism, but I'm not sure that serves our purpose from the point of view of political theory. The kind of populism we're talking about is it's initially unique to the 20th century. What I'm talking about, and the populism that starts out as deeply concerned about people's hopes and dreams and ends up being manipulative of their fears and hatreds. That's a uniquely American phenomenon, although it quickly spreads to Europe. But it's like fundamentalism. It's born here, like before, as Karen Armstrong makes really clear in The Battle of God. The fundamentalist movement as we know it is incubated in Christianity and then infects Judaism and then infects Islam. There's always been conservatives, but not this kind of literalist sort of thing. I think the same is true of populism. But you really hit it on the head when you say it amazes you that American populists twist the teachings of Jesus into xenophobia and replacement theory. You're right. It's absolutely stunning. And the question has been asked by I've got a lot of thoughtful evangelical friends who can't believe what's happened to their movement, that there's nothing Jesus-like about their movement at all, right? It would have been, hateful to Jesus. It would have been hateful to Hillel. It would have been hateful to anyone from that period that was a progressive thinker in that time. But to twist Jesus' teachings and come up with xenophobia and replacement theory it's stunning. And also to say that one of the basic arguments against climate change is that God wouldn't do that, right? God's in charge of everything, and God wouldn't allow there to be climate change. It's like the guy who is stranded on the roof of his house during a Mississippi flood, and the boat comes by the first time, and he says, "No, thank you, my faith's in the Lord." And another boat comes, and then a helicopter comes, and finally, as he refuses them all because my faith is in the Lord. And finally, as he is going down for the last time, he hears the voice of God saying, "I sent the boat twice, then I sent the helicopter."
We have time, Jim, if you can, for a few questions, you can put them in the chat. Again,
I do see a couple. I see Carol, by the way, Carol Green. On Tyranny by Tim Snyder is really excellent. I couldn't agree more. And there is an article that you can find that is Tim at his best. Tim Snyder is one of my favorite people. And this appeared in the New York Times Magazine when? I think January of this year. And it's called The American Abyss. That's all you need. I would do Snyder, The American Abyss. It is fabulous, and it's about what we talked about today. Tim Snyder is really, really incredible. And I had, Jack, I had a little clip of Jason Stanley from Yale, and you can find it on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and search on their search engine for Jason Stanley, How Fascism Works, and you can find a really nice 10-minute clip or the hour-long version of Jason talking. He's terrific. A lot of his ideas, like on the mythic core and so on, are folded into my talk. And I was going to show you a clip, but we didn't have time. So I agree with that. And there's my website.
I'm glad you agreed with everything in the chat. I put in a link to Timothy Snyder and the American Abyss. Thank you, Jack, for Jason Stanley. And again, if you need help during the week, you can't find some of these resources, be sure to reach out to me. Any questions?
Stuart also asked, what about the book Hiding in Plain Sight? It's on my shelf, and I have to shamefacedly confess that I haven't opened it yet, but it came highly recommended. Sarah, is it Kenzador? Hiding in Plain Sight. Supposed to be wonderful, but I can't testify. But you just did, so we'll recommend it. I think that's everything.
So with one question for our community who is focused on Tikkun Olam and repairing the world, what can we do in the face of some of these different, I'm going to call them obstacles that you have shared with us today? What are your marching orders, Jim?
First of all, when I just also saw a question from Gail, why should we not be concerned that fascism will not win here? You never heard me say don't be concerned. This was a whole hour and 15 minutes about be very concerned. When I said, should I worry about these things? My answer was yes, you should worry. You should be concerned. But there are a lot of missing things that would be necessary. We would need much, much more in the way of a complete, thoroughgoing, and consistent economic meltdown for fascism to have a foothold, for a full-blown fascist government to have a foothold. But proto-fascism can manipulate, can subvert, can pervert the institutions of justice and fairness and so on, and they're doing that now. So that's something to be concerned about. So what do? We identify those groups like on the progressive side, Indivisible, the ACLU, and others that are working hard to forestall some of these efforts. Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, is doing more with his group. He has put together a group that is dedicated to identifying, shedding light on, and then doing everything possible to block with legal action, voter suppression action. So you support, with your time and your treasure, you support the people that are doing the good work. What you don't do is waste any time having an argument with your idiot of a neighbor whom you love very dearly but can no longer talk to. People, for years that I was involved in a global interreligious movement, people would ask me, so how do you talk to fundamentalists? You don't. It's a waste of their time, it's a waste of your time, and it's a waste of blood pressure on both sides. So instead, you talk to people that are on the fence. If you know people that are somehow concerned, they're not convinced, but they're concerned, is the vaccine safe? Or was the election really stolen? Those are the people you talk to. And I've found that if I take up an idea, or if someone else takes up an idea, you can be sure that there are thousands of other people that have just had that same thought and are just turning to someone to share it. So when you're doing your little part in a conversation with one little other person, remember that you may represent a very significant movement. You may be part of that movement. And saying no to that impulse in yourself deals a tiny little blow against that movement. So we all know, last thing I'll say is we all are the best judges of how much energy we have, how much treasure we have, and how we ought to use it. But the one thing we don't want to do is not be doing anything.
Agreed. And one last question. Do you think the GOP can turn this around at this point?
Can the GOP turn this around? You mean reverse the tables?
Yeah, I think it's from.
Or turn it around for the party.
I think turn it around for the party. That's how I'm going to go with that. This is so fascinating. One of the most interesting questions in American politics today is the GOP. Is it broken beyond repair?
You know, after Goldwater got creamed in 1964, everybody said, well, that's it for the Republican Party. 4 years later, Nixon won, and not only won, but reversed the polarities of the parties. The South became Republican. It had been Democratic forever. So we have to be careful of those predictions. But I would say that the Republican Party looks lost to extremism at the moment. So I would say that either a new party is born, a new party of moderate conservatives, still faithful to conservative values, but eschewing, dumping all this extremism, a sort of Lincoln project of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
That to me seems likely. But the other thing, I said there are two possible outcomes. Does the Republican Party sweep all before it, as parties tend to do in midterm elections? The out party tends to do very well. They don't have to pick up too many seats in the House, will they? Or is this a special set of circumstances? Is this whole going all in on the steal and going all in on voter suppression, is that going to backfire? My best guess is that the voter suppression is going to backfire big time. It did last time, and I think it will. We said we're going to make voting as hard as possible. And you're going to stand in line forever. And people throughout the South especially said, okay, we'll stand in line forever. And they voted in greater numbers than ever before. Voted successfully in greater numbers.
Both Richmond and Ellen Gusson say to me, our Tikkun Olam committee has so much going on. We're going to be working on this. It's not a one-shot deal. We have many different campaigns planned out. So watch your mind, Macomb at home. I cannot thank Jim enough. It's given us a lot to think about this morning, and to continue our action through Tikkun Olam, through your own political actions, were spurred on. So thank you, everyone. Next week is Rebecca Kersner from HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant and Aid Society, and she'll be talking about refugees.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Bye.